Okay, now that we've quilted our mini quilt, we're going to add our binding. So I chose this stripe. I think it adds a lot of drama and some interest to our mini quilt. Stripes make the perfect binding. I pre-cut some 2.5-inch strips. I love 2.5-inch strips because I hand bind the back of my binding to my quilt, and it just gives me a little bit of extra room to play with. You can do 2.25 if you like. It's totally up to you. And I just kind of gauge before I piece my strips together, sort of to make sure that I have enough. And this looks like 2 strips will cover this, which is great. So let's put these together. Right sides together, and again, I'm using my cutting mat as my ruler to keep everything straight. So you lay one on top of the other. And you can pattern match if you want. This might be okay. And then all we're going to do is we're going to iron this back to create a crease so that we can sew along the crease. You can use a fabric marker if you like. It's totally up to you. I just like the crease. Okay. And then we're going to take it over to our machine and we're going to sew along the crease. And you can pin this in place if you want, but you're just following the crease and just keeping everything lined up. Okay. Once we've done that, we're going to trim our 1/4-inch seam allowance. Just following our stitch line, cutting a 1/4 of an inch over. There's our binding, and that actually looks pretty good, almost pattern match that. So we're going to open up our seam here. I like to open up the seams when I attach my bindings together. That way there's no extra bulk. All right, that looks pretty good. Now the next step is to create your binding. You're just going to fold this over and iron this down. Sometimes you need to readjust a little bit. Totally okay. There we go. So now that you have that, you need to attach it to your mini quilt. And because most everybody is right-sided, you don't want to finish your binding on the right side because you'll see that little joint that you put. So just find maybe another spot like the bottom or another edge that you want to start on. So we'll start here. And then what I like to do is lay it out and give myself a little bit of a tail to start with, because I'll probably start sewing a little further down. And I just kind of like to eyeball how this will come together to make sure that the joint that we, so where we joined the 2 pieces together to create our binding, it's going to fall in this corner, and that will create a lot of bulk when we go to turn this binding out. So I'll need to adjust that. Let's see if I have enough. So I might pull that down to be more in the center, further down. Oh yeah, I think we're good to go. Okay. So we'll start here maybe. Yeah, that looks good. Yep, that works. All right, so you're just taking your raw edges, lining it up with the edge of your quilt sandwich, your quilt top, your batting, everything that you quilted before. And you're just going to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch around. And we're not using any fancy walking foot. We're just using our regular presser foot, needle, coordinating thread. Stitch length is back to normal. And you're just going to follow the edge of the binding and your quilt. And then when you get to a corner, this is where you want to slow down a little bit. And you're going to stop and pivot 1/4 of an inch to the corner. And you can use your rotary, your cutting ruler if you want to see where 1/4 of an inch at. So I have just a little bit more to go. And this will give you your mitered corners. Okay. Lift up your foot, pivot, and stitch off the corner. Great. All right, so now we're going to turn. How I like to do this is, you'll have your line here that you've sewn off. You're just going to use that as your miter point. You're going to flip over, and then you're going to flip back down, lining everything up to the edge of your quilt. And you can pin this, or you can use a binding clip if you want to hold everything in place. And then we're just going to keep sewing. Slow down for our corner. And that looks like 1/4 of an inch. Let's pivot. Same thing. We're going to use our stitch line to create our mitered corner. Fold up. Fold down, line everything up. That looks really good. Use our binding clip to hold everything in place. Then sew down this edge. One more time. But this time we're not going to sew all the way down because we need to join our two tails together. Okay. Binding clip holding everything in place. Make sure we're all lined up. And I'm going to sew just a little bit and then I'm going to stop. All right, so now we have to join our two tails together. And I have a lot of tail. So I'm actually going to trim this down a little bit. You can use scissors or you can use your rotary cutter. You're just kind of giving it a little bit of an eyeball here. And then you can, so you're going to overlap your two tails 2 1/4. So get out your ruler. 2 1/4. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a pull. You don't want to give it too much of a pull. And there we go, 2 1/4. So now you're going to lift up your 2 tails, right sides together. And we're going to sew diagonally across. You can use your binding clips, you can use pins to hold this in place. Or you can just eyeball it. All right, so then we're going to take this to the machine. Sort of do some origami to get our quilt and our binding in here together. Or just go from one corner to the other. Straight line. Perfect. All right. So now you want to give it a little test to make sure before you trim your seam allowance here, you want to make sure that everything's going to lay in there pretty flat, and that looks good to me. So you can take your rotary cutter or you can use scissors to trim this 1/4 inch. Just creating that seam allowance. And then you want to iron and press your seams open. Get a little steam there. And then I just like to gently press it back in place. You don't want to press it too much because it could distort the binding and sort of make it wonky. All right, that looks great. And now we're going to close up that hole we created with our tails. Starting a little bit before I stopped to kind of create a back stitch to give it a little extra security. And then you're just going to and I stitched over where we started attaching the binding. Do a little back stitch if you wanted. And there we go, our binding is attached. Now, what I like to do next is take my corners, take the corner of my quilt, press it gently into my binding. Do that all the way around. Give it a little push in there. Sometimes you have a couple of loose threads, just trim those out. Okay, and then I take it over to the iron and I give it a little press. Press all of my binding edges over. Use a little steam. Oh, the stripe looks so good. Right. And then the final step is actually attaching your binding to the back side of your quilt. Now I like to use my binding clips to hold it in place. And I just kind of start in the middle and I work my way to the edges. I place them every 1.5 to 2 inches. It's whatever you're comfortable with. Get rid of any loose threads. And the main goal is you want to cover up the stitches that you did to attach the binding. And if you cover up some of your quilting stitches, that's totally okay too. Now when you get to the corner, you're just going to fold this in because we've tucked that in there. You're going to fold it like you would if you were going straight, and then you're just going to create that miter by folding this top part over. And then put a binding clip in place, and then keep going. And I like to hand stitch my binding to the back, but you can machine stitch it as well.